Many Filipinos today wrongly believe that only the elite during the Spanish colonial era spoke Spanish. And even more absurdly, there are those who have said that for the more than 300 years of Spanish colonization, the Spaniards made no effort to teach the Filipinos Spanish. While seemingly ridiculous, it is difficult to blame them because some of the most well-respected historians claim that when the Filipino national hero, Dr. Jose Rizal, published the Spanish-language novels No le metangere and El filibusterismo in 1887 and 1891, only a few Filipinos could understand them, because the language of the masses, so they say, was Tagalog. In this lecture, using forgotten accounts from the 17th through the early 20th century, I will disprove these claims and try to explain why this misconception developed and persists to this day. Before delving deeper into the state of the use of Spanish, however, it is important to address a subject that is often overlooked and assumed to be a non-issue. That is, the use of Tagalog from the 16th to the 19th century. As mentioned in the introduction, historians often claim that the language of the masses, the ordinary Filipinos of the Spanish colonial era, was Tagalog. Yet, there is evidence to disprove this commonly held belief. One of the most important comes from the accounts of a distinguished advocate of the Tagalog language, Hermenegildo Cruz. In 1906 he wrote, "May mga ilang taon na namamalas ko ang paglaganap na matamis na wikang Tagalog dito sa bayan natin. Nangangailangan ng mga sadyang bagay upang pag-iral niya ay maipatuloy na walang untul-untul sa landas na talagang itinakda sa kanya ng panahon. Wala nga akong ibang pakay, kundi ang makatulong sa ilalim ng konting kung kaya sa ikaririlag at ikalalaganap na matamis at mayamang wikang Tagalog na sa mga panahong ito'y gumigiit na sa atin at kusang nagbubukas pa man din ng landas sa pamumuhay at pakikipanayam ng maraming Pilipino na sa ganitong pangyayari, maaring umasa tayo na darating ang isang panahong ang wikang ito'y sasapiling ng iba't ibang wikang ginagamit ng mga bayan sa Sansinuko." From this account, it is clear that even after 10 years since the execution of Dr. Rizal in 1896, Tagalog was still in the process of becoming the language of the masses. Thus it can be said that even if Dr. Rizal had written No le metangere and El filibusterismo completely in Tagalog, the masses would not have understood him in 1887 and 1891, unless one adopts a very ethnocentric view of Filipino history and count only the Tagalog people of Luzon as the masses, ignoring the existence and importance of the other ethnic groups who participated and contributed to the propaganda movement and the Filipino Revolution, such as the Ilocano, Cebuano, and Ilonggo people. We are therefore left asking, if Tagalog was not yet the language of the masses at this time, what was? It would be fairly simplistic to argue that if Tagalog was not the language of the masses, then automatically it must have been Spanish, because the Philippines is so linguistically diverse that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to say which was spoken more. Nonetheless, it was precisely this diversity which necessitated the use of a common tongue that was ethnically neutral. This language was the one advocated by the Ilustrados during the propaganda movement, that is to say, Spanish. While Spanish, being a foreign language to the Filipino, cannot be regarded as the true language of the masses, it did serve as a means of common communication between the various ethnic groups, which would have made it the de facto language of the masses of that period. That is why during the Philippine-American War, when the Cebuano general Arcadio Mahilom rallied the Filipinos of the Visayas to defend the República Filipina, established by Presidente Emilio Aguinaldo, who himself was of Tagalog background, General Mahilom appealed to the Visayan soldiers and civilians in Spanish. Similarly, this ethno-linguistic diversity is also the reason why Ilonggo General Martin Delgado communicated with the Tagalog and Ilocanos in Malolos, the former capital of the República Filipina, in Spanish. The leftists among us may argue that these were just examples of Filipino bourgeoisie. It is important to keep in mind, however, that the prominent leftist Ilocano, Isabelo de los Reyes, and the proletariat Tagalista, Hermenegildo Cruz, also spoke and wrote in Spanish, and even gave their workers' organization a Spanish name, La Unión Obrera Democrática Filipina. The use of Spanish by the Ilocano Reyes and the Tagalog Cruz was not bourgeoisie. It was, as with the case with Mahilom and Delgado, mere practicality. Skeptics may argue that these men could not have possibly represented the majority of the Filipinos, and may even claim that they must have been self-taught, because they believe that the Spanish never sought to educate the Filipinos and teach them Spanish. Unfortunately, the evidence that could best refute these claims was written in Spanish, which is a language made foreign to the Filipinos, with the American occupation of the Philippines, following the unjustified, illegal, and still unrecognized U.S. overthrow of Presidente Emilio Aguinaldo and the República Filipina in 1901. If Filipinos of today were actually taught Spanish to the same degree that we are obliged to learn English, then the evidence mentioned would be accessible to all readers interested in Filipino history and culture. The evidence referred to include first-hand accounts by individuals who are actually alive and lived in these islands during the time when the Philippines was still a part of Spain. One of the earliest accounts which disproves the notion that Filipinos were not taught Spanish and not educated by the Spaniards comes from a work annotated by Dr. Rizal himself called Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas, or Events in the Philippines. The author of this book was the judge of the Real Audiencia de Manila, or the Royal Court of Manila, Antonio de Morga. In addition to teaching Filipinos about the Catholic faith, Antonio de Morga reported in 1609 that the Spanish missionaries trabajan en adestrarlos en cosas de policía suya, teniendo escuelas de leer y escribir para los muchachos en español, enseñándoles a servir la iglesia, canto llano y canto de órgano, y tocar ministriles, danzar, cantar y tañer arpas, guitarras y otros instrumentos en que hay tanta destreza. Especialmente alrededor de Manila, que hay muy buenas capillas de cantores y de ministriles, de los naturales, diestros y de buenas voces, y muchos danzantes y músicos de los demás instrumentos que solemnizan y adornan las fiestas del Santísimo Sacramento y otras muchas del año, y representan autos y comedias en español y en su lengua con buena gracia. By the next century, in the 1700s, not only did the Filipinos learn Spanish, but by then they had become even more proficient in the Latin alphabet than in their own native alphabet, baybayin. In Arte de la Lengua Tagala, the Spanish Franciscan author, Sebastián de Totanes, wrote in the mid-1700s, No se trata de los caracteres tagalos, porque es ya raro el indio que lo sabe leer y rarísimo el que lo sabe escribir. En los nuestros castellanos lean ya, y escriben todos. It should come then as no surprise that the Spanish Franciscan, Juan Francisco de San Antonio, would describe the Filipinos in 1738 as muy buenos traductores, or very good translators, and further say that una comedia de español la traducen con primor en versos de su propio lenguaje, or in other words, that the Filipinos translated Spanish comedy with great skill into verses in their own language. Sadly though, this is a surprise to many Filipinos today. Despite the evidence presented here, the myth of Filipinos not having learned Spanish was popularized in the 20th century, following the overthrow of the Spanish-speaking República Filipina of 1899 and the subsequent American occupation. To justify the annexation of the Philippines and the betrayal of Filipino revolutionaries who fought alongside American forces in the Spanish-American War, American officials, politicians, and the U.S. media launched anti-Filipino and anti-Spanish propaganda, wherein Filipinos were depicted as stupid little children whom the Spanish failed to civilize, Christianize, and educate. During the Philippine-American War, the president of the independent República Filipina, Presidente Emilio Aguinaldo, was depicted as a bloodthirsty dictator, much like Filipino presidents of more recent times, and also as a little boy in need of Uncle Sam's guidance, as can be seen here in an 1899 political cartoon from Puck magazine. To further cement this image of Spanish-era Filipinos as being medieval, illiterate barbarians, or as U.S. Commissioner Dean Worcester called one of the native tribes, half devil, half child. Around 1,000 indigenous Filipinos from the mountains and the most rural areas were brought to the St. Louis World's Fair of 1904 to represent the more than 7.5 million Filipinos, most of whom had already been Christianized by the Spanish. While the Filipinos of the early years of American occupation resented being portrayed as head-hunting dog-eaters, Filipinos of today have actually bought into this racist portrayal of Spanish-era Filipinos. Filipinos themselves have now come to believe that so-called progress only came with the arrival of the Americans, as the Americans like to claim, which you can see here in this 1908 article from the San Francisco Call entitled "The Aristocratic Filipino Club, One Striking Proof of Progress." Thanks to this so-called progress, Filipinos can only understand their history and culture from the American perspective, because with the imposition of English, the thousands upon thousands of important historical documents which were written in Spanish by both Spaniards and Filipinos, relating to our literature, music, languages, architecture, religions, art, cuisine, political history, and so forth, are incomprehensible to the mostly English-speaking Filipinos. Most of them who hear this lecture would not have understood the passages I quoted from Antonio de Morga, Sebastián de Totanes, and Juan Francisco de San Antonio without the English translations, and would likely go on believing the American myth that Filipinos were never educated by the Spaniards. Although in fairness, the perpetuation of this myth does not lie solely on the legacy of Americanization by the former occupiers. We Filipinos must also accept blame, for there are claims based on half-truths that have now become just as popular. One claim is that Filipinos never learned Spanish because it is said that Spaniards communicated with Filipinos in Tagalog in order to intentionally keep us divided and ignorant of the Spanish language. While this claim is not completely without merit, it is nonetheless false. Spaniards, unlike the American occupiers, did in fact learn the native languages of the Filipinos, not just Tagalog, but also Ilocano, Cebuano, Kapampangan, and Ilonggo, to name a few, and even made great effort to write a number of books that addressed the indigenous languages and their literature, such as Ortografía Tagala, 1776, Arte de la Lengua Iloca, 1627, and Arte de la Lengua Bisaya, 1637. However, they did this not to keep Filipinos ignorant, but because they learned from their experience in their other colony, Mexico, that learning the native tongue facilitated the conversion of the natives of that country. Franciscan missionaries in particular, who also served in the Philippines, noted that a friar of their order by the name of Pedro de Gante had greater success in winning over the loyalty and respect of the natives of Mexico in comparison to other friars, by learning and communicating in the native language of the ancient Aztecs. Padre de Gante was widely respected by fellow missionaries, and undoubtedly influenced the Spaniards, who sought to replicate his success in the Philippines. Although the Spaniards followed de Gante's model and made great strides to learn and teach fellow Spaniards how to speak the native languages of the Philippines, this did not mean that the Spanish never intended to pass on their language to the Filipinos. As was the case with Mexico, learning the languages of the conquered was a practical means of breaking down communication barriers with the natives. Ultimately, though, the end goal was the Hispanization of all Spain's subjects, Filipinos included, not just in terms of religious beliefs, but also with regard to other aspects of Hispanic culture, most notably the Spanish language. Taking into consideration all that has been said, a natural question to ask is, why did the Ilustrados in the second half of the 19th century feel the need to establish more schools to teach Spanish, if the language was already taught by the Spaniards and spoken by the population? Reading Dr. Rizal's work, we get the impression that the Spaniards were doing a poor job at teaching the language. For in Noli Me Tangere, we see that a Filipino schoolmaster felt the need to take it upon himself to teach Filipino youth Spanish, whom he believed were receiving insufficient education from the Spaniards. Upon closer inspection, we realize that the answer is not simply a lack of effort. While the contravida or antagonist of the novel, Padre Damaso, ridiculed the Filipino schoolmaster for teaching and speaking Spanish, the bigger problem, as Rizal himself pointed out, was not so much that Spain opposed teaching Spanish. After all, the Filipino schoolmaster himself mentioned that the Spanish government actually ordered that it be taught. Rather, a major impediment was that the lessons often revolved around memorization of religious doctrine and required the patronage of the religious orders, who advocated corporal punishment as part of the instruction. Thus, the Ilustrados were not exactly saying that Spain made no efforts to teach Spanish. Instead, what they were advocating was secularization, reform in the methods of instruction, and lessons that were more practical in daily life, such as metropolitan manners and agriculture, which was mentioned in the aforementioned novel. In the world outside of Rizal's novels, there is also another reason why more schools were needed to teach Spanish. There was a lack of teachers. Much of the instruction, as well as the matters of church, of the provincial Filipino relied heavily on the Spanish friars, who, in 1898, the year Filipinos won their independence from Spain, only numbered to approximately 1,108. Essentially, the education of more than 5 million Filipinos rested on the shoulders of less than 2,000 friars. If not all Filipinos learned Spanish, it was not for a lack of effort or because they strongly opposed teaching modern foreign languages, including Spanish, as the U.S. Library of Congress claims. Rather, there were a lack of teachers to teach. Because of this, Filipinos, much like the schoolmaster in Nole Me Tangere, were left to fill in the void. That is, they became educators to fellow Filipinos. Many today would probably scoff at such a thought, given that the image left behind by the early American propaganda was that of Filipinos being nothing more than mere servants, subjects, and even slaves of Spain. But it is often overlooked that there were Filipinos who were teachers during the Spanish colonial era, such as Artemio Ricarte, who was a schoolteacher before he became a general in the Philippine Revolution. What is also forgotten is that in the first 2 centuries of Spanish rule, short-handed Spanish friars themselves sought out Filipinos to assist in their missions to the provinces, with them serving in a variety of capacities, from interpreters, teachers, and even musicians. Thus, if Filipinos were Hispanicized, it was not through Spanish efforts alone. Yet, considering that the Ilustrados were still campaigning for more schools, this would suggest that the combined Spanish and Filipino effort up to that point was still in need of more work. Just how much more work will likely never be known. What is clear, though, is that much of the assumptions we have held thus far about the use of Tagalog and Spanish from the 16th to the early 20th century is in desperate need of re-examination. Equating all Spaniards with Padre Damaso, as we have done for the past century, is an oversimplification of the Filipino experience. While there were indeed Spaniards like him, we should also acknowledge that not all Spaniards sought to keep Filipinos ignorant, nor did all of them look down on us. If anything, the accounts of the Spanish, like that of Antonio de Morga, stated with pride the effort of the missionaries to educate the Filipino. After all, the Filipinos' ability to learn was a reflection on the Spaniards' ability to teach. When Filipino history is stripped of its nationalistic interpretation and the anti-Spanish propaganda of the early American occupation, and when Filipinos regain the ability to speak Spanish once again, they will realize many things that up to now seem unthinkable. First, that Tagalog was not the language of the masses in 1896. Second, that the Spaniards actually made an effort to teach Spanish to the Filipinos. And third, that the use of Spanish was far more widespread than previously believed. How widespread was Spanish use is difficult to quantify. Reducing this number to the number of schools in existence in 1898 ignores the fact that education did not always take place in that setting, nor were lessons always taught by Spaniards. Having been born almost a century since the Filipinos won their independence from Spain in 1899, I cannot speak from personal experience as to the extent that this language was used on a daily basis. I will, however, leave you with the words of someone who was actually around when Hermenegildo Cruz and José Corazón de Jesús were still promoting Tagalog. Señora Soledad Lacson Locsin, translator of Dr. José Rizal's novels, had this to say before passing away in 1995. I belong to that generation that came about at the turn of the 20th century, when Spanish was still the language. And although the Americans had already been here for a few years, the perceptions and mores of my early childhood were still largely influenced by the backwash of 4 centuries of Castilian rule and Catholicism.